Welcome everyone to the Rotary Club of Jacksonville Zoom at noon meeting. I will now call the meeting to order by ringing of the Rotary bell. We have an exciting program today. Thank you for joining us. During the program, everyone will be on mute, so feel free to submit questions by utilizing the chat function. I also want to remind you that today's presentation is being recorded. John Chapelier will provide today's invocation. John?
Let us bow our heads in prayer. Through the indwelling power of faith, let us move forward with conviction. With the struggles and challenges that this year has provided, our goals, resolutions, and intentions may have fallen by the wayside. To regain clarity and commitment, once again, let's move forward towards these goals and dreams, and let's all take a moment to reflect on what exactly that means, to believe in something greater than just ourselves. Faith is an attitude of trust and confidence. To activate our spiritual connection, if you haven't done it already, please close your eyes. Gently breathe in and out. Let go of any fears, concerns, or stresses that you may be carrying. We are strong, calm, centered. We are untouched by limiting thoughts of conditions. We can now look beyond any lack and experience true freedom. With our intentions set clear and straightforward, our fears dissipate, and we can now move ahead with confidence to claim our good, because good is always in charge. Amen.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Jerry.
For those that joined us today before the meeting, thank you. It's great to see everyone networking. I want to thank you, Jeannie Terrace. Oh, goodness gracious. I want to thank you, Jeannie Terrace, for hosting our club social last Thursday. Join us at 5 o'clock this Thursday, the first Thursday of each month, for our club social. I also want to thank all of you for your patience as we learn the new ways to engage and network. I'm happy to report that our committees are continuing to meet and work efficiently through breakout meetings, both before and after our Monday meetings via Zoom. If you chair a committee and have not met, I need you to contact Sherry this week to arrange a committee meeting. It is very important that all committees continue to function, so if anyone has a question or problems, please reach out to Sherry. Or so that we can be sure that if you need assistance, you get it. Please be sure to mark your calendars for our district seminar on October 24th. All leaders and all committee chairs need to attend. Details were in last week's issue of the spokesman. At this time, I will turn our program over to past District Governor Tommy Grimes, who will bring us the eulogy of Rotarian Hank Baker. Tommy?
Thank you, Jerry. Hank Baker passed away peacefully at home on August 28th, just 17 days shy of his 102nd birthday. On his last day with us, he visited with his family and had a wonderful discussion with a good friend who is a retired Episcopalian priest. He then went to sleep, knowing that all was good and his life was complete. Hank was born in Brooksville, Florida, grew up in Campville, which, to help those of you geographically challenged, is just north of Hawthorne, but close to the Gator Nation. He moved to Jacksonville in 1936 to attend Massey Business College. After completion, was employed by the Robert Meyer Group, who owned the Roosevelt Hotel, where this club met at that time in his life. More importantly, he met his wife, Dorothy Davis, who passed away 5 years ago. They were newlyweds for 77 years. During World War II, Hank served in the U.S. Navy Reserve as a Chief Petty Officer and was honorably discharged in 1945. He returned to the hotel business and continued to work with the Meyer Group in Jacksonville and Knoxville. 1953, he returned to Jacksonville to become the office manager at Western Natural Gas. 56, he accepted a position as controller of the Southern Propane Company in Jessup, Georgia, where he was vice president and general manager. 74, Hank returned to Western Natural Gas, eventually becoming president, chairman of the board, and where he continued to work until he died. Hank was not only a successful businessman, but also supported and participated in numerous civic and charitable causes. He was a proud member of Rotary International for 62 years. He joined Rotary in Knoxville and continued in Jessup and Jacksonville. He was a Paul Harris Fellow, a major donor to the Rotary Foundation, and had perfect attendance for more than 50 years. He served in many capacities in our club and had a very special interest in the membership committee, where he served as vice chair. He brought many new members into our club who were exceptional leaders in their own professions, as well as community servants. His devotion to that task found Hank recognized with the prestigious District Service Above Self Award in 2005. He was a member of the Florida Yacht Club and Timuquana, as well as an avid Gator fan. He was also a dedicated Episcopalian for over 60 years. Hank was a man of quiet integrity, compassion, and dedication who led by example. His word was his bond. Ask Hank to do anything, and it was always accomplished on time and without drama. He appreciated the simple things in life. He had a great sense of humor, and this kept him and others going, both in the good times and the bad. He had a gift for bringing history to life, engaging anyone listening with his perfect memory, telling things about his early years and his marriage to his beloved Dorothy and the beautiful family they created. One of their children, son Ken, recently received the Distinguished Service Award of the Rotary Foundation. One endorser and a past Rotary International president described Ken as one who quietly goes about doing good. He was just like his very, very proud dad. Ken is a member of West Jackson and served our Rotary District as governor in 2004 and 5. We are grateful for the many years Hank served in our club and the leadership values he passed on to others. Memorial service is planned for the future. In place of flowers, the family will be requesting donations to Good Shepherd for the Rotary Foundation.
Thank you, Tommy. Please join me in a moment of silence for Hank Baker. Scott Eder will introduce today's speaker. Scott is a veteran of the United States military and over 30 years of service to the United States government. Scott?
Thank you, President Jerry. Good afternoon, fellow Rotarians, and Tommy, thank you for those wonderful words. Thank you very much. Leadership development is very important to me, as well as for Rotary International. But having experienced programs in and out of government for about 40 years, I still believe it receives too much lip service rather than actual implementation. What we'll hear today presented is what I see as a program that's actually working, both in implementation and results. Dan Bennett is the director of the Millennium Leadership Program at the Atlantic Council Center for Leadership Development. As director, Dan manages the Millennium Fellowship, the council's flagship accelerator for rising leaders, ages 25 to 35. Beyond this leadership program fellowship, Dan oversees the center's broader agenda of activities, which involve all thematic and regional areas of the council's work, as well as the center's executive education portfolio and network of over 500 fellows, which spans over 80 countries. Dan is a graduate from Georgetown's Institute for Transformational Leadership, holds a professional coaching certification equivalent degree in executive coaching with a focus on leadership and career coaching. And he is also certified in the Leadership Circle assessment. Prior to joining the Atlantic Council, Dan worked in Cairo, Egypt, coordinating youth outreach and advocacy programs during the Arab Spring. He earned his bachelor's degree in international relations with a minor in Arabic at Tufts University and studied Arabic at the American University in Cairo. Dan spent 13 years living in 6 different African countries and currently resides outside Washington, D.C. On a personal note, I've known Dan's parents for nearly 35 years. Assigned to Zaire, now the Congo, Dan's father and I jokingly blamed a local beer that we enjoyed for what became the 1988 birth of Dan and my eldest daughter. Ironically, they graduated together 18 years later from the Northern Virginia High School. Fellow Rotarians, it's my great pleasure to present to you the Atlantic Council's Dan Bennett.
Scott, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I feel myself blushing, honestly, so thank you for that. And thank you so much to the members of the club for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today about my work, which is really using leadership development as an instrument for global impact and to make a difference on global challenges. If you'll bear with me for 1 second, I'm actually going to share my screen because I have a presentation to accompany my remarks, and then we'll get started. Okay. So as Scott mentioned, my name is Daniel Bennett, and I work at an organization called the Atlantic Council. It is a nonprofit foreign policy and national security think tank in Washington, D.C. And we are a nonpartisan institution. And the agenda of our organization, which is broad enough to encompass the political views of both main parties in our country, is simply to advance solutions to global challenges that put the United States and our allies and partners that share our values of democracy, rule of law, individual freedom, and market economies at the center of those solutions. So very much our organization is one that is committed to advancing American leadership in the world for good cause. I run something called the Millennium Leadership Program at the Atlantic Council, which is our Center for Leadership Development, Education, and Engaging the Next Generation, so young people. Within our center, we have programming for students and undergraduates, all the way up to executive education programs for more senior leaders. But the focus of my talk today is going to be around the work we do for the millennial generation, specifically the 25 to 35 age range, through our Millennium Fellowship, which is our flagship accelerator, as Scott mentioned. Before I start, just on a personal note, I want to share that ever since I began doing this work almost 10 years ago, I feel like I've had the best job in the world, and I feel so grateful and fortunate to do it. Because what I really do is I spend half of my time scouring the earth for the most inspirational and impactful people who are part of my age group making a difference in the world, and the rest of my time partnering with them in their evolution as leaders. And that's a journey I get to share with them, and it's something that I find incredibly rewarding to play my small role in helping equip these people to make the enormous impacts that they're able to make in the world. And it's something I'm excited to wake up and do every morning, and I hope I get to share a little bit of that with you today. So when we think about leadership development as an instrument for global impact, we think about it through this lens of how do we meet the moment of today's challenges and the challenges of the future through leadership. And there are really 6 key challenges that form the core of our work. The first is the breakdown of what we call the rules-based global system. Another way to think about this is how do we revitalize the architecture of institutions, multilateral organizations, alliances, trade structures that have really since World War II been responsible for a 70-year period in modern history that has seen a rapid growth in prosperity, in peace, and in individual freedom around the world that truly is remarkable and historic and has never occurred in the past. And just to put this into context, before World War II, or right at the end of World War II, there were only 17 democracies in the world. In the last 70 years, that number has exploded to 96. At that time, there were just 12% of the world's population living in a democracy where they had access to their individual freedoms and rights. Today, over 50% of the world lives in a democracy. So it's really been a golden age in terms of freedom in the world. Similarly, in terms of prosperity, at the beginning of the 20th century, 2/3 of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. Between World War II and today, that number drops to just 10%. And in terms of peace, during the centuries leading up to World War II, you had on average 1 to 2% of the human population perishing in war. But in the 70 years afterwards, that number drops to less than 1/100%. So by and large, this rules-based global system, which is based on the values that I mentioned at the beginning, the values of the United States and our partners and allies around the world, has been responsible for a flourishing of prosperity, peace, and freedom in the world. But that system is beginning to fray at its edges as it confronts a new set of challenges in the 21st century, for which it was not initially designed in the midpoint of the 20th century. And that's the first big global challenge that we need to develop the leaders of the future to meet. Underneath that, there are 5 others that nest and are kind of part of explaining why that's happening. So the first is navigating the return of great power competition, which is really a nod to the rise of China. The second is revitalizing democracy and market economies as the models through which we govern ourselves politically and economically. These models, which have been part of the success of the last 70 years, have faced a relative decline in influence globally over the last few decades because we've seen a parallel increase in the influence of authoritarian and autocratic models of government. The next one is harnessing rapid technology change. And that's not just social media and what we see emerging in the digital domain. It's also developments in life sciences, genetic engineering, exploration of space and utilization of the domain of space, and a whole range of other technologies that have the potential to remake the geopolitical landscape. After that, it's climate change. Specifically, how do we transition our world to a lower carbon energy system that allows us to still meet the energy demands of our countries and developing nations, while at the same time stewarding our environment. And then finally, the linchpin to making all of this possible is how do we rethink America's leadership in the world? Because none of these things can really be achieved if the United States exits the leadership stage. If that happens, the result is a vacuum is created, and that vacuum is either filled by chaos, which is not necessarily in our interest, or it's filled by other actors who then have the prerogative to remake that system and write the rules that we now have to follow. And those rules in that system may not be designed with our best interest in mind. So how do we rethink America's role leading, again, alongside partners and allies from a place of our shared values in the future? And the role of my work at the Atlantic Council is really to develop a new generation of leaders to do that. So when we think about the millennial generation, which, as I've just said, is kind of the one that we're expecting to defend and preserve democracy and capitalism in the future, one of the major challenges we confront is what I refer to as a leadership deficit. So over 50% of millennials surveyed in the last decade actually are dissatisfied with the way democracy is working in their country. Similarly, a frightening statistic is that over 50% of millennials surveyed actually say they would prefer a strong leader over parliament and elections. There's lots of data like this out there that you can find. And the high level takeaway is that while we need this generation to really advance these ideals in the world, paradoxically, this generation has some of the lowest levels of confidence and belief in these ideals at home in our democracies. So we have a problem here, which is how do we reinstill faith in these models? And then also how do we work with these leaders to fix the aspects of our international system where democracy and capitalism are no longer working the way that they ought to. The second indicator of this leadership deficit that I want to point to is the historically low level of trust that millennials actually have in their leaders to make the right choice. So just about a quarter of millennials living in democracies trust government to do the right thing always or most of the time. And if you look at surveys over the years, this number has continued to decrease pretty consistently through the past decades. And it's not really a surprise when you think about the world that we grew up in, particularly in the United States, where our experience of geopolitics and international affairs is a war in Iraq, where it's not obvious whether or not the blood and treasure spent were worth it. It's a 2008 financial crisis that led to us all having to delay having kids, getting married, buying property, and ultimately resulted in us being the first generation that's not likely to make more money than our parents. So essentially a stalling of that American dream of prosperity and growth that has been part of our tacit agreement with democracy as citizens since the beginning. And then politically, it's living through this period of time where there's incredible division within our society, where at any given time, half the country doesn't necessarily feel like our elected leaders represent us. And of course, the era of disinformation and election interference. So it's not surprising that the millennial generation is somewhat disillusioned with this model. But the truth is, over 70 years, this model has been responsible for incredible growth in our society, and it needs to be adapted to the 21st century. So how do we overcome this challenge of a leadership deficit with the millennial generation? Well, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that the millennials are actually the largest living generation in history, which means just by virtue of our numbers, we have the ability to remake the system in profound ways, for better or for worse, depending on how we show up as leaders. The second thing to keep in mind is the aperture for intervention in this trend from a standpoint of leadership development, which is actually that the window is open now, but it is rapidly closing. The reason is that the second largest generation is the baby boomers. And as they begin to retire, what we've seen is that millennials are beginning to fill those leadership roles that they inhabited as executives, as members of the national security councils and the situation rooms in capital cities around the world. And as that transition unfolds, which will actually end up being the largest generational transition in power, the largest passing of the torch, if you will, in history, there is a window to begin to shape the world that these future leaders will ultimately create by actually shaping the leaders themselves while they are still young. And that transition is happening right now, and the window to do that through leadership development is right now. So that's the work of the Atlantic Council, the challenges we look at, and why it matters. Now, in terms of how we do it, our philosophy on impact really has two parts. That quote on the top, I'm not going to read in its entirety because it's quite long, but it speaks to the first part of our philosophy, which is essentially, don't try to change everyone in the world. Start by just trying to change yourself. And this reflects our program's focus on a deep, sort of individualized approach to leadership development, where we're really trying to offer something truly transformational on an individual basis to each leader we work with, rather than something more standardized and cookie cutter that we could do in terms of training 1,000 people at a time in the same way. The second part of our philosophy on impact is, rather than trying to train many, many people and influence many people directly, we prefer to focus our investments in a small number of ultra high potential future leaders who themselves can go out and have a multiplier effect in the world. And this is reflected in the well-known quote by Margaret Mead, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Now, in terms of our approach to these leaders, obviously we need to be very careful when we select, because we're taking that approach where we only work with a small number. And our sort of approach to this is to mirror the global and multidisciplinary nature of these 21st century challenges in the way we constitute the program. So for every cohort of 20 fellows we select, we review over 1,300 candidates from over 100 countries. We select 1 to 3 cohorts a year, depending on our resources. And at the core of the program and our selection process is diversity. Because we believe if you're going to develop the type of global leadership skill set required to work in this 21st century environment of global challenges, you need to be able to work across boundaries of religion, of nationality, of professional sector and background, and obviously across boundaries of gender and ethnicity. So we incorporate all these factors of diversity into our selection process, and every cohort we put together represents a wide range of backgrounds, countries, has 50-50 gender diversity, all ethnicities represented, and we even have a psychology-based leadership style assessment so that we can ensure everyone selected even leads in a different way in terms of their personality. Now, what this means is, as a fellow in this program, you are working global challenges together with these different types of people. You are never going to be an American working a global challenge with other Americans who look and think and lead the way you do. Actually, you are always going to be an American leading or working these challenges with people from different countries, backgrounds, professions, who even lead in a different way from you. And that's the perfect classroom to begin to cultivate this global leadership skill set, which requires working across boundaries, particularly when you think about the necessity of the United States to work with its allies and partners as it leads in the 21st century. The other thing it means is that you have the benefit of learning from perspectives and approaches quite different from your own by people who are quite different from you. Of course, when we select, we also take into account demonstrated leadership potential, and every fellow has to be doing work that connects to these 6 big issues in some way. We have 500 fellows and alumni across 82 countries, as Scott mentioned in the beginning. You can see those countries represented on this map. The colors, the depth of the color indicates the density of our fellow population in that country. So the United States is the country where we have the most fellows. 1/3 of those 500 are based in the United States, but we also have good representation throughout Europe, South Asia, in East Asia, and really across all the NATO partner countries, the countries that share our democratic market-based values. In Latin America and Africa, we are a bit less well represented, but we still cover the 4 points geographically of both of those continents. All told, 1/3 are North American, 1/3 are European, and 1/3 are global fellows representing every other major region except Antarctica. Similarly, we have a wide range of backgrounds represented. I won't go through these in detail, but the key thing I want to message from this slide is that while all these people are under 35 years of age, which is it always blows my mind. I'll say one of the hardest parts of my job is keeping my ego in check, because I'm working with people who are sometimes younger than me, who are already accomplishing things I could probably never accomplish in my lifetime if I tried. But while they're all under 35, they are not junior as leaders. These are people who are already leading at a high level, and we have a reliable expectation that they're going to have decades of global impact ahead in their futures. And this is coming back to that philosophy of invest deeply in a small number of people who can have a multiplier effect. So they include ministers of foreign affairs, ministers of finance, ministers of defense. These are the equivalents of a secretary of state in our country, but for foreign countries, elected officials of all different types, C-suite executives at global firms, award-winning artists, authors, scientists, people developing the next generation of artificial intelligence and other things, and of course, leaders at the major multilateral institutions that really do need to be reformed for the 21st century, like the United Nations, like the World Bank, and others. Those names on the right side, by the way, are just a snapshot of some of the fellows in the current 2 cohorts I'm working with right now. In terms of our approach to leadership development, we have something we call a 21st century leadership accelerator. Really, there's 3 pillars to how we approach this. We build skills and competencies, and you can think of this as the how to lead effectively. We work with fellows to clarify values and align those values, the values of democracy, rule of law, and everything else I've mentioned, align those values behind the impact that they're having in their career, so that they're not just leading and working in a vacuum as a business person, but they actually are connecting the dots between what they can contribute professionally and how they can make a difference on these global challenges. And then finally, the what, which is really understanding these issues in a geopolitical sense. And that's one of the major value adds that an organization like the Atlantic Council can offer. So that's the how, the why, and the what of leadership. One thing I want to emphasize on the slide, and this speaks to the 21st century moniker for our program, is that we are the only program of our kind that's blending the cutting edge resources and best in class resources that utilize data, psychology, and modern management science available in the private sector through partnerships with executive search firms and leadership advisory firms. We blend those 21st century leadership development tools with world-class academic resources, which we borrow from the Harvard Kennedy School and the School for Public Leadership there. And that's where we marry the theory and the concepts with the science and the data. We put those 2 things together, and then we bring in a 3rd dimension, which is this unique ability to put that in the context of global challenges in geopolitics with the subject matter expertise and the content and the unique access to practitioners and policymakers that an organization like the Atlantic Council can offer. There's no other leadership development program that's putting these skills and tools in that global challenges context the way we do, because there's no other think tank that has access to that content like we do, that's working across boundaries with academia and with business on this subject of leadership development. What this approach looks like practically is the fellowship is a 12-month program. We have a hybrid approach to delivering the content. blending virtual and in-person engagement. There's 50 hours of virtual content stretched out over that 12 months. It includes individualized executive coaching. Every fellow works with a certified executive coach. We have master classes with senior leaders on the big challenges, people like Madeleine Albright, former national security advisors Jim Jones and Steve Hadley. We even have done classes with presidential candidate Joe Biden and others. So they have a chance to meet and learn from these people who are wrestling with these issues on the front lines every day. We have our adaptive leadership and immunity to change framework workshops. This is the curriculum we borrow from the Harvard Kennedy School. We have a peer mentorship and peer consulting methodology to actually delivering a lot of this content, which we've developed here at the Atlantic Council, where through the course of the program, every fellow actually has to work the leadership challenges of every other fellow. So by the time you leave, you've had people from all over the world consult you and work your own leadership challenges, while you have had the chance to work the challenges of everybody else using these frameworks. And one of the benefits of this is by the time you graduate out, you haven't just practiced the skills, but you've built this extraordinary community of peers around the world who really trust you and have strong relationships with you. And that peer group approach becomes the backbone of our alumni community after the program ends. We have also a training curriculum around executive presence, soft skills, and different sort of tactical leadership skills like negotiation and communications. We partner with the executive search and advisory world to deliver a lot of that content. And then finally, I mentioned those psychology-based leadership assessments and the data-driven approach we take to this. We're the only program that I'm aware of in this space that does a baseline assessment of every fellow and then an end line assessment so that we can actually empirically measure the impact on a person's leadership development and approach over the course of the program. This is one of the big challenges with leadership programs in the world, is that they are very abstract and they're difficult to measure empirically. And we're one of the only programs that's actually begun to bring a rigorous data-driven approach to how to do this and actually show what makes a difference in terms of numbers. There's also 2 weeks of in-person activities, an orientation and retreat at the beginning, a retreat at the end before they graduate out, and then in the middle, our annual study tour, which is probably the thing we are most well known for. And I'll talk about that a bit in my next and final slide. Finally, there are events throughout the year that are optional where they can gather. There's the peer group-based alumni community, and then there are impact projects and deliverables that fellows use the platform of the Atlantic Council to go out and make happen. One of the things we do in that deliverables part is we actually provide every fellow a platform to speak, write, and begin to build a thought leadership profile. So some of these pictures on the left-hand side you see include our fellows speaking at the 2018 NATO summit. That's the picture in the middle. And the picture at the bottom is 3 of our fellows coming off stage and unmiking themselves after doing a panel discussion with Madeleine Albright at the event we hosted called the Future Leaders Summit in 2016. So in closing, I want to talk a bit about our study tours and place a spotlight on that, because this is one of the most unique things we do. So we don't just deliver and train this content in a kind of abstract way. We actually take fellows to the front lines of these global challenges to sort of experience them in the field and spend time wrestling with the issues that the leaders on the ground wrestle with on a daily basis. We've done 20 of these tours in over 24 countries. I'm going to talk a bit about last year's tour to Colombia to explore sort of the outcomes of the FARC peace process, because it gives me an opportunity to highlight some of the unique aspects of this. So one thing is when we do these tours, we really try to avoid our fellows being treated like the kids' table. And to the Atlantic Council's never-ending credit, my organization really deploys all of its political capital to get fellows as much access as possible to the most senior leaders in these countries. And this is something that's very uncommon when you look at young leaders programs around the world, and particularly in the think tank industry. Usually if they do a delegation like this, they're going to meet with mid-level staffers. When we went to Colombia, we met with the president, Ivan Duque. We met with his predecessor, President Uribe. We met with the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Interior, the National Security Advisor, and others. So we get a chance to meet with the most senior decision makers in that country. But that's not the only thing we do. We don't spend all of our time in the capital city in boardrooms. We actually also went out into the jungles to meet with former FARC fighters, former ELN fighters, former paramilitary soldiers, and peacemakers in those towns across Colombia who are wrestling in a very real way with this tension between peace and justice in their country. That's the type of 360-degree comprehensive sort of tactile experience of the challenge that we create in our study tours. And the Atlantic Council has the benefit of access to senior leaders, but also the ability to go to the front lines that allows us to deliver this really unique sort of opportunity to apply the learning in real time on the ground. Whenever we do these tours, we try to go to places where the issues are somewhat contemporary. So Colombia, right after the FARC peace process. The year before, we did Turkey and Greece, tracing the 1,000-mile journey that Syrian refugees take, beginning at Syrian camps on the border with Turkey, through southeastern Turkey, across the Aegean Sea, where we actually went out with the Turkish Coast Guard and rescue operations on the Aegean Sea, and then ending ultimately in Athens. We've done tours throughout Europe. We've done tours in the United States. Most of our tours are international. We've also done programs in India and Pakistan and throughout North Africa and the Middle East, including Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere. And next year, our planned tours are actually for the Arctic and in Hong Kong to look at kind of the frontier of the fight for democracy in Hong Kong. So that brings me to the end of kind of showcasing the program. I covered things at a high level. I'm eager to answer questions if there are any. The last slide here, if folks want to go into it, I can bring it back up, just simply looks at the calendar and how we stitch these things together. It also includes a bit about how the program is resourced, how we make this all work from a funding standpoint. And I'm very happy to talk about how to get involved financially and also what it looks like to resource a program like this, where we're providing these opportunities essentially free of cost to public sector leaders and civil society leaders from 82 countries around the world. So I'll stop there, Scott. I'll hand it back over to you. And I hope you guys felt the energy from me today. I'm very excited about this work and pleased to have had the chance to share it with you.
And we have a series of questions. The first question is from Jim Overton, and his question is, what is authoritarian capitalism?
Great question. So authoritarian capitalism is the model that China used to grow and lift 1 billion people out of poverty. Essentially what it is there is very little political freedom in the country to choose your leaders, and the state has a command control approach to managing the economy. So there is competition allowed, but only in very circumspect domains. And there really isn't a free market or free enterprise approach to economic activity. And there certainly isn't political freedom with regards to choosing the direction of the country or the leaders. This model has been very successful from a state planning standpoint in a country like China. And unfortunately, that success has become a model that a lot of developing nations are eager to emulate, and in some extent blend with our own Western model of open markets and democracy. This is one of the most concerning things as we look at the future, which is that our democratic capitalist way of life now has kind of a competing alternative out there the way it did during the Cold War. And for the first time in really 30 years, it's not inevitable that the spread of democracy and markets will continue. It really is a jump ball because this alternative model has some very appealing benefits. The thing that we need to keep in mind is that China's rapid growth over several decades would not have been possible without the tremendous consuming power and the global market that our democratic model also provides, right? So it's an appealing approach. It comes with downsides. There's also a predatory nature in the way that China exports this model to places like Africa and Latin America. And it's something we can definitely talk more about.
So the next question is from Jeannie Terrace, and the question is, can the deindustrialization of the U.S. be reversed to lead in the betterment of the millennials' earning potential?
It's a fascinating question. I'd be so well served by having some of my colleagues who work on these policy issues specifically answer that question. The answer is, I don't know. I think there's a trend towards what's referred to as the fourth industrial revolution. And it prompts me to think about deindustrialization in the light of the creation of many jobs in the digital economy that may ultimately give us a pathway to employ and provide more meaningful career opportunities to millennials in our country, and maybe begin delivering once again on the promise of open market democracy to this age group. The other part of me, though, realizes that as these developing nations rise up the economic ladder, that industrial output is going to continue to get pushed further and further away from the United States. And you're going to see some of the challenges we've felt here in the United States by our middle class feeling wage stagnation and a decreasing job market. You're going to start to see some of those challenges emerging in countries like China as well, as they start to outsource some of their industry. And there's other trends that are more, recent on this, right? Like, how does COVID affect the way we think about global supply chains? How do our national security interests, as we sort of confront the competition with China, how does that affect the way we think about our global supply chains? I mean, there could be a very strong argument to bring a lot of industry back to the United States and classify it as national security priority, because we can't depend on a country like China to produce things like masks if we end up in a public health crisis, right? There's almost a national security argument to reindustrializing as well. It's an excellent question, and something that I don't know that I can answer well, but it's definitely going to figure in prominently in how we think about engaging millennials in our economy.
So the next question is from Scott, and he goes, regarding other actors, how serious is China and Russia influence in your efforts, or are they a threat?
Can I ask for a clarification? When you say my efforts, you mean our leadership development program, or more broadly this idea of?
I think Scott Eater's referring to your leadership development program.
Okay. It's interesting. We have a lot of difficulty recruiting from China. There's technical reasons for that. Facebook doesn't penetrate China effectively. If you are a young leader in China who is actively trying to move the needle on an issue like democracy, it is very risky for you to take a public appointment in a program like mine. It puts a target on your back in some sense. Having said that, we do get really, really interesting candidates from that part of the world who have relocated. So one of my fellows is this gentleman whose name is King Chow, and he's based in New York, and he has 40 artificial intelligence patents to his name, and he leads a research arm of IBM Watson's project, the IBM project to develop the next generation of artificial intelligence. So there are these brilliant change makers from these parts of the world, but we have trouble accessing them unless they've actually left their countries. In terms of Russia, it's interesting you should mention that. The Atlantic Council has actually been listed as sort of I can't remember the exact designation, but essentially an organization that's a national security threat in Russia, because we do so much work to counter Russia. And it's a similar thing. When we recruit Russians into the program, they're almost always living in other countries where they are free to speak and engage in this type of activity. So we don't have any direct undermining efforts, although they do target my organization quite regularly. But fortunately, I'm not in the departments that are actually running active election monitoring in Eastern Europe or anything like that. So I'm not a primary target of their activities, but we do have trouble getting people from these countries to engage.
And so the next question is from Howard Dale. Authoritarian capitalism recognizes rising inequality. How does your group at the Atlantic Council train to reduce this risk to democracy and freedom in market-based economies? Do you recognize, that's the question, does the Atlantic Council recognize rising inequality? And how do you reduce this risk to democracy and freedom in market-based economies?
Absolutely. It's a huge focus of our work, which is how do we remake this system so that we can begin to basically spread the benefits of this model more equally? And how can we create new opportunities? Again, I'd be served by my colleagues who really hold this portfolio from a policy standpoint to talk about the exact strategies for how we do that. But what I can say is that our organization's approach to this issue and other issues like it is to recognize that the United States can really not meaningfully move the needle on this issue by itself. It requires us to lead alongside our partners and allies in an international context. And one of the reasons is that when we look back at the way the United States was able to kind of create this system and sort of set off the momentum that carried us through 70 years of prosperity, we had such a preponderance of economic and military and political power in the world that we actually were able to enroll other nations in this plan. And other nations complied by the rules, and we were able to organize our activities together in a coordinated fashion to bring about things like modern globalization and free trade. But today, we no longer have that overwhelming sort of asymmetrical advantage of influence on the global stage. There is a competition between our model and others. So however we're going to be able to do this, whatever the specific strategy is, whether it's technology governance in the transatlantic domain, whether it's that allows us to trade technology and have sort of an open digital ecosystem between us and our allies in Europe, whether it is free trade agreements between the United States and partners in the Pacific or something like that. However we do this, we can't do it unilaterally, right? It requires a constructive leadership by Americans with partners and allies around the world. And I'd say that's the first part we need to get right, because right now we're struggling a little bit with that.
So the next question is from Chris Makalakis, and his question is, what is your source of funding?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. So we really have three revenue streams. Because the program is so competitive to get into, 20 people per group from 1,300 plus candidates. We also have a nomination pathway through which partners can actually sponsor the participation of an individual. We still evaluate this individual against our standards, but we don't evaluate them competitively against the other 1,300 people because their spot is already paid for. So that's the first pathway for revenue. We have several global companies who nominate someone every year from among their ranks. We also have foundations and institutions that basically sponsor us to select a person from a community that they want to support. So for example, in this year's cohort, we had a foundation who really wanted to see a young Iraqi leader benefit from membership in the program. So we recruited against that, and we recruited candidates in Iraq, and we presented that candidate to the partner, and they said, this person's great. We would love to support their participation. So that's one avenue. There's also a program fee structure for people who come from major corporations. They pay full freight so that we can offset the cost for everyone else. All the public sector and nonprofit leaders and many of the private sector leaders who come from sort of small and medium-sized businesses, entrepreneurs, and certainly from outside the United States, they all participate essentially on scholarship because of those first two models. And then the third revenue stream is we partner with usually governments to resource our study tours. So next year when we go to the Arctic, we'll be doing that in partnership with funding from the Norwegian government. So they'll help us cover the flight costs, the hotel costs, and things like that. And those are our three primary sources of funding. We have some other bits. We have some individual donors. We have some other kind of at-large foundation support and things like that. But for the most part, it's a self-sustaining business model based on nomination sponsorships and these study tour partnerships.
So I think you just answered that question, but the next question is from Bill Sorensen, and is, how do you find your candidates? Yeah,
so we have a pretty robust recruitment campaign every year. It'll actually be kicking off probably next month for the 2021 cohort. So I can go into the detail on the different parts of this, but I'll say that we probably reach well over 1 million people in a targeted fashion between Facebook ads, Twitter ads, and other types of paid digital content. We also have a long list of former applicants, thousands, that we email and ask them to either reapply if they're eligible or share the opportunity with others who they think might be a good fit if they're an alumni. And then we have the Atlantic Council's broader community where we take nominations and recommendations from thousands of staff and non-resident fellows and other kind of members of our community. So all told, we reach a pretty broad global audience through this, from which we end up sifting through 1,000 or more candidates for every cycle. Where this gets kind of tricky is actually in the selection process, because frankly, when you have 1,000 candidates for 20 spots, you're left saying no to a lot of really amazing people. And this is one of the things that gets very difficult for us later on in the selection process, is how do we kind of choose between two equally impressive, passionate young members of parliament in Europe? Because I'm not going to, in a group of 20, you want as much diversity as possible. So you're probably not going to take two people like that. And we end up leaving a lot of incredibly talented leaders on the table at the end of every year. But those people come back into the recruitment campaign for the next year, year after year. So we have that benefit as well.
We have more questions, but we're out of time, Daniel. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
You are welcome. It's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We will not meet next Monday in observance of the Columbus Day holiday. Be sure to join us the following Monday, October 19th, for a special treat where Kelly Shaw and Gerald Thomas will bring us the Home Fire Campaign featuring the American Red Cross. I'd like to recognize past District Governor Ken Baker, who's also been in attendance. At the conclusion of this meeting, our Zoom platform will remain open. Some of you attending the new member orientation or the Manual of Policies and Procedure Committee meetings. Those invited to those meetings should see an option to join on their screen. Be sure to look or click on the breakout button at the bottom or side of your screen. If you're expected to be in the meeting and do not see an option to join, please drop a note in the chat area of your screen. This will allow you to admit you into the meeting. For the rest of you, especially Daniel, thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to having you next week at our Zoom meeting. This concludes today's meeting of the club. Thank you for coming.